Here's a book I found at the local library that I wanted to show you, Swords and Artist's Devotion. This is pretty neat as kind of visual reference and inspiration for artists and role players. This is not a historical reference book. So actually let me talk about that first. So the author does list the sources in the back, which is good. So you can see right here, bibliography. And it does have some of the standard books that you would want to consult for this sort of thing, like Oakshott, The Archaeology of Weapons. Then we have Ian Pierce, Swords of the Viking Age. This is really good stuff. I don't know about all of these sources. I'm not familiar with all of them, especially the ones about Asian swords and swordsmanship. But that's good to see. However, overall, as said, this is not a historical source that you should, for example, this here. I mean, this is a good example. This is clearly fantasy. This guy has nothing to do with any historical Celts or Germanians or anything like that. This is pure fantasy. So it still has some historical facts, of course, like those Bronze Age, Iron Age, and the migration style swords, and they're quite nicely drawn. Here's something about the saga of Beowulf. It was quite high quality. So really nice drawings. This picture as well is really largely fantasy. That shield, for example, that's not what Vikings used. It's too small, and the way he carries it looks like it's a strapped shield, whereas Vikings actually use center grip shields. So while you're holding them, they just are placed differently. But there's some good information here as well. Like this, what's called here, slipping. This technique is mentioned in the sagas. And people who try to recreate Viking martial arts, which, by the way, is very difficult because we don't have actual manuals. Those have also used this kind of technique, and it seems to work pretty well. What I personally find is that it makes edge alignment more difficult, but for power generation, it's definitely good. And here's a bit about female warriors who are occasionally mentioned in the sources, usually with some astonishment, because of course it wasn't the norm. But fighting women did apparently exist, as far as we can tell, just not that very common. Here's a bit about the weapons of commoners, the messer, of course, or knife. What they called a knife. It was officially classified as a knife in legal terms because of the way it was constructed, which the peasants were then allowed to use, whereas a knight's sword was not allowed. There was something interesting here that I wasn't actually aware of. Chains connected to a breastplate. So I was skeptical at first, and I looked it up, and apparently there are actual finds in museums of breastplates with a chain connected that would link it with the sword, or perhaps a shield or a helmet, so that they wouldn't drop their equipment. It seems weird, it seems cumbersome and everything. I don't know if this was just for use on horseback. Seems likely, but I don't know that much about it. It's interesting to see that, though. And then we've got the spiked pommels here. Now that's how you end them rightly. Those we see in the historical manuals. This is a picture from one of the manuals. And I've never seen any find of a sword with a pommel like that, actual archaeological find. I don't know if they exist. If they do, they must be really rare. It would make sense for certain techniques, but the fact that they're shown in the manuals isn't necessarily proof that they had such swords. There is such a thing as artistic freedom, of course, but it seems plausible enough. There's a bit of information about how a sword was made. You know, the masterpiece could cost a small fortune. Yes, for sure. Swords were very expensive back then. I mean, if you think that modern high-end reproductions are expensive, that's nothing compared to what they cost back in the day. So, pretty interesting. That looks quite nice. Then here's something about samurai, which I'm not personally interested in. Yeah, and then we have... I don't know much about the topic, but this really seems like the Hollywood ninja. It doesn't seem like what little I know about actual historical shinobi. There are a lot of myths, for sure. And this whole, all black combat suit is certainly not what they wore, at least most of the time, because it's not exactly inconspicuous. They were generally spies and had to disguise themselves as, farmers, craftsmen, traders, samurai, a variety of things. So, yeah. I'm a little dubious about the validity of these sources, to say the least, especially since, as far as I know, this kind of ninja-to, so-called, is a Hollywood invention. So, yeah. Apparently they just used shortened standard katanas. Yeah, here's something about Korean weapons, which I know nothing about at all. Dual wielding on a horse. Again, I'm a little skeptical if that is accurate, but I simply can't say. I don't know. And then we've got Chinese stuff. Again, really nice drawings. Definitely like that. Oh yeah, here's some of the more exotic weapons. Got the shark tooth, well, swords if you want to call them that. You could also call them serrated clubs or whatnot. And there are some really strange things. So if you're looking for fantasy weapons that are actually grounded in history, then you can take inspiration from that, because there are some things that we don't normally see from non-Western cultures that look like they are right out of a video game, because they just look crazy. But they were used, so they must work, right? Like stuff like this in particular. And there's something even stranger. Let's see, I think it was on this page. Yeah, a quoit-headed sword. So quoit is also called a chakram. So that would be the throwing metal disc, or ring rather, that you see in India. So I've never seen this kind of thing. That is really, really strange. Or knife blade axe. And this is also a really bizarre sword. India has some really, at least from my perspective, really strange weapon designs. And in some cases, I find it hard to believe that even works. Like this here, for example, this kind, I don't know how this is attached, but this seems like a real weak point. And some of those things I find hard to believe that they were actually used. But I guess they were. So certainly intriguing. And there we are. So as said, this is quite a nice visual reference guide. Not so much for historical information. There is some good information in there, but not all of it. Just to give you one example of a not so accurate statement, it says right here that the pommel provided a counterweight so that the user could balance the sword and wield it comfortably. That is a common misconception. It depends on the type of sword. Some have a fairly large solid pommel, which does have a significant effect on the balance. But there are also hollow pommels, which don't really do that much. And more important for the balance is the shape of the actual blade. You can do a lot through the blade geometry, for example, with a distal taper or profile taper and the thickness. There are a lot of ways in which you can change the dynamic balance of a sword, and the pommel is really a rather minor effect on that. So this is a good introduction for people who have only just started getting interested in swords and are looking for basic introduction and information. So it's not that much text, it's really more drawings, but yeah, as said, worth a look. I'll leave a link in the video description to where you can find it, and thanks for watching.